The night always hits first with the smell. Not the smoke or the gunpowder, but that strange mix of wet earth, tired bodies, and something you can't quite name. The kind of smell you know you'll never forget, even if you live to be 100. The first night of World War I felt like that for a lot of young soldiers. One moment they were boys who slept in warm beds with real pillows, and the next they were standing in a trench, staring into darkness that felt way too alive. Most of them didn't sleep at all that first night. Some tried. They leaned against the trench wall, wrapped themselves in scratchy blankets, and told themselves it would be fine. But the truth is, nothing about that night felt fine. Every sound felt like danger with a capital D. A twig snapping somewhere in no man's land. Probably an enemy army. A whistle of wind. Definitely a bullet, according to the guy in the corner who hadn't stopped shaking for an hour. Even the rats made their grand entrance like they were auditioning for a horror movie. A lot of soldiers described that first night as the moment the war truly became real. Up until then, everything was uniforms and marching and shouting officers and letters from home. But night stripped all of that away. Night didn't care about patriotism. Night didn't care about speeches. Night just sat there, heavy and cold and full of possibilities that kept a man wide awake. Some soldiers joked to deal with it. Jokes were basically the only warm thing available. One British soldier wrote that he told his friend, "If I don't make it through the night, tell my mother I still blame her for not letting me get a dog." The friend apparently laughed so hard he forgot to be scared for a whole 5 minutes. Gallows humor, they called it. The darker the joke, the better it worked. For many, that first night was just shock. Pure shock. They had trained for battle, sure, but nobody trained them for how long darkness lasts when you're scared, or how loud your own heartbeat can sound when you're lying in mud, trying to pretend you're not thinking about home. Even the bravest guys felt it. The officers tried to act calm, but even they jumped a little whenever a flare went up and lit the whole world in ghostly white light. There were rules. Of course, orders. Don't light anything, don't talk above a whisper. Don't poke your head over the trench unless you have a secret wish to meet a sniper. But rules didn't control the mind. And the mind, when it's tired and terrified, gets creative. Soldiers imagined footsteps that weren't there, shadows that moved, figures watching them from across the dark. Some admitted later they spent half the night awake because they were convinced the enemy was 10 seconds away from jumping into the trench. Spoiler, the enemy was also convinced of the exact same thing on the other side. Trying to sleep during that first night was like trying to nap during a thunderstorm while lying on a pile of sticks. The ground was cold, the walls dripped water, the uniforms felt like someone designed them intentionally to poke you. And every few minutes someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" Which guaranteed that nobody heard anything except their own panic. But slowly, in small moments, a kind of pattern formed. A soldier would slide down the wall just enough to rest his head on his pack. Another would close his eyes for a few seconds between flares. Someone else would breathe in and out like he was trying to hypnotize himself into dreaming. They didn't get real sleep. More like tiny bits of half-sleep that slipped away as soon as a rat ran over someone's boot, or a sergeant barked an order, yet even that helped. Even the smallest nap felt like a victory. One soldier joked that his 10-second nap should have earned him a medal. Another said he dreamed of chicken soup, only to wake up with mud in his mouth. Not quite the same thing. By morning, everyone looked like they had aged 10 years. Eyes red, uniforms wet, brains foggy. But there was something else, too. A strange toughness. They had survived the first night. They had learned that fear doesn't kill you, that darkness doesn't last forever, and that somehow, even in the worst places, the human body will try its best to rest. Kind of comforting in a weird way. The first night of the war didn't give them sleep, but it took away something else. The idea that things were going to be quick or easy. From that night forward, sleep would become something to fight for, like food or warmth or hope. A battle inside the bigger battle, and that was just the beginning. The mud was the first thing everyone complained about. Not the enemy, not the officers, not even the cold. Just mud. Endless, sticky, soul-stealing mud that felt personal, like it had a grudge against every single soldier. By the second night, most men agreed the mud was winning the war more effectively than any army. It didn't matter which trench you were in. British, German, French, Ottoman didn't matter. The mud treated everyone equally. You'd take one step and your boot would disappear all the way to your ankle. Take another step and you'd swear something grabbed you from below. A few guys joked that there were ancient trench monsters living under the muck, just pulling at boots for entertainment. Honestly, after a few weeks, nobody would have been surprised. Trying to sleep in that mess, forget it. The second night taught soldiers that the trenches weren't just uncomfortable. They were basically torture chambers designed by a very damp, very angry architect. The walls sweated water. The sky dumped rain whenever it felt like it. Even the floors had puddles that somehow stayed cold even when everything else was warm. Some men slept sitting up just so they wouldn't wake to the feeling of cold water creeping up their sleeves. And then there were the rats. Oh yes, the rats. Big ones, bold ones, the kind that looked at you like they paid rent. Soldiers joked that the rats were better fed than they were. Some swore they saw rats the size of small dogs. One guy claimed he saw a rat dragging an entire loaf of bread across the trench like it was doing meal prep. Nobody believed him, but nobody didn't believe him either. The rats came at night most often when it was quiet and nibbled on anything. Boots, rations, letters from home. One soldier said a rat tried to steal his blanket, and honestly, he just let it have it because he didn't have the energy to fight a rat at 2 a.m. That's where sleep deprivation takes you. Rain didn't help either. When it rained, the trenches turned into mud soup. Men tried to sleep with their heads resting on their knees just to avoid sinking. Some men got so tired they tried sleeping standing up, leaning against the trench wall like sad statues. Didn't work. They'd slide down eventually. Gravity always wins. But even with all that, the nights were bizarrely loud. People imagine nighttime on the front as quiet, peaceful, maybe a little eerie. No. Night was noisy. There were shovels hitting earth, soldiers repairing walls, boots squishing through mud, quiet arguments about whose turn it was to take watch, rats having their nightly Olympics, distant gunfire, and the occasional shouted order that nobody appreciated. And above all that, there were the sounds from the other side. Footsteps, whispers, metal clinking. The enemy was doing the exact same things just a few meters away. Sometimes soldiers swore they could feel the other army breathing. It kept everyone awake even when their eyes were begging them to shut. Still, soldiers learned tricks. They made tiny sleeping spots, little dugout pockets carved into the trench walls. Some were barely big enough to lie down in, but it was better than sleeping on mud that sucked the warmth out of your bones. They stuffed sandbags around leaky spots. They used their coats as pillows. They even slept with their rifles hugged to their chests like very uncomfortable teddy bears. Sometimes someone would finally drift off, only to wake up because a drop of cold water landed right on their eyelid. One soldier wrote, "The trench had better aim than the enemy." Honestly, he wasn't wrong. The trench world was a full sensory experience. You could feel the mud crawling into your socks. You could hear the rats plotting. You could smell, well, everything. Wet wool, unwashed bodies, moldy sandbags, gunpowder, old food. If smell could talk, trench smell would say, "Good luck getting any sleep tonight." But people still tried. They leaned against each other for warmth. They shared stories. They laughed quietly about things that weren't funny. Anything to feel human for a few minutes. Anything to trick the mind into resting, even if the body refused. And the strange thing? Eventually the impossible became normal. The mud was still there. The rats still stared at you like they owned the place. And the rain still fell whenever it felt dramatic. But soldiers slowly learned how to grab tiny slices of rest between the chaos. Not real sleep, but something close. Something enough to get them through another day. The trenches after sundown weren't just wet and miserable. They were alive. And every night, soldiers learned a little more about how to survive a world that seemed determined to keep them wide awake. There was a special kind of quiet in the trenches at night. Not peaceful quiet. More like the quiet you get right before someone jumps out and yells boo. The kind that makes your shoulders tense even when you're trying to relax. Soldiers didn't just fight the enemy during the day. At night, they fought their own nerves. Everyone knew the enemy was close. Too close. Sometimes just 30 or 40 meters away. Close enough that if you really listened and the wind was feeling generous, you could hear someone on the other side coughing. Imagine trying to fall asleep knowing a guy with a rifle, bad aim, and strong opinions about your uniform is basically a few living rooms away. Makes sleeping kind of tricky. The fear wasn't dramatic. It was slow, creeping, the kind that wrapped around you like a wet blanket. Soldiers lay there thinking about night raids because raids usually didn't happen at noon with a polite knock. No, the enemy preferred the hours when your eyelids were heavy and your brain was mush. Men slept with one ear open. Technically impossible, but they did it anyway. Boots stayed on. Belts stayed on. Rifles stayed at arm's reach. Nobody wanted to be the guy who woke up during a surprise attack still trying to lace his shoes. One soldier joked, "If the enemy attacks, I want to at least die fully dressed." His friend replied, "Bro, I haven't taken my boots off in 3 weeks." War fashion was not great. The worst part was the listening posts. Small pits dug out in front of the main trenches where a soldier would spend hours in total darkness, just listening. That's it. Just listening to dirt shift, branches snap, and his own imagination screaming. Some soldiers said their brains made up entire armies marching toward them when really it was just a rabbit doing its night shift. Sometimes a flare would go up, lighting everything in a glowing, ghostly flash. For a few seconds, the battlefield looked frozen in place. Mud, wire, craters, and shapes that might be bushes or might be people. Soldiers froze too, hoping they weren't standing in a pose that made them look suspicious or easily shootable. When the light faded, the darkness felt even darker. Every now and then, someone would swear they heard movement, or breathing, or whispering, and everyone else immediately went into paranoid owl mode, eyes wide, heads turning. 90% of the time, it was nothing. The other 10%, well, that's why nobody slept soundly. A few unlucky souls learned the hard way that the enemy also got bored at night and liked to sneak around cutting wire or checking for weaknesses. It wasn't just fear of the enemy either. It was the fear of not knowing, of imagining things. A soldier once wrote that the silence felt like it was stretching forever like rubber, which is probably the most poetic way to say, "I'm losing my mind out here." There were moments of comedy, though. Soldiers woke each other up with false alarms all the time. One guy thought he heard footsteps and accidentally kicked his friend awake. The friend woke up swinging and yelled, "I thought I was being kidnapped by the Germans." Turned out it was just a rat with big dreams. Still, even with the jokes, nobody really relaxed. Every soldier had a story of almost falling asleep only to jolt awake, convinced someone was standing over him. Some slept sitting up because lying down felt too vulnerable. Some stayed awake out of pure stubbornness. Others tried to sleep only to dream of being attacked, which was honestly rude of their brains. The truth was simple. The enemy didn't have to shoot to keep you awake. Just being there was enough. Just knowing someone else was awake, watching, listening, planning. It made every night feel like a test you hadn't studied for. Sleep wasn't just sleep. It was a risk, a gamble, a moment of trust in a world where trust got you in trouble. And yet, soldiers still tried. Still drifted off for a few minutes at a time. Still fought the battle between their heavy eyes and their jumpy nerves. Night in the trenches taught them this: fear never really sleeps. It just takes short breaks. The funny thing about artillery is that it doesn't care what time it is. Morning, afternoon, midnight, makes no difference. When the shells start flying, they fly like they've had 3 cups of coffee and a personal grudge. And when you're trying to sleep, even a single distant boom feels like someone slamming a metal door right next to your head. Most soldiers learned very quickly that nights in World War I weren't quiet. They were full of echoes, deep, rolling thunder from miles away, sharp cracks from closer guns, the long whistle of a shell dropping somewhere you hoped you weren't. Sleep didn't stand a chance. Some guys tried to pretend they got used to it. They'd lie down like, "Ah yes, just another lovely night listening to explosives." But nobody really got used to it. You can get used to bad food. You can get used to wet socks. But explosions? No, your brain refuses. Every boom shook the ground, shook the air, sometimes shook your teeth. Hard to drift off when the earth keeps vibrating like a broken washing machine. The worst were the long bombardments. Hours of non-stop shells. Sometimes days. Soldiers didn't sleep at all during those. You couldn't. The constant noise pushed every thought out of your head. Some men tried covering their ears with their hands. Others stuffed bits of cloth inside. Didn't matter. Artillery isn't just sound. It's force. You feel it in your chest. One soldier wrote that during a bombardment, he didn't sleep for 72 hours straight. He said by the end, he started seeing things that weren't there. Trees walking, shadows whispering, a horse made of lightning. His friend had to shake him every few minutes to keep him grounded. That's what lack of sleep does when mixed with fear and noise. It turns your mind into a haunted house. And then there were the silent nights, the ones everyone claimed they wanted. "Please, just one quiet night," they'd say. But when they actually got one, nobody trusted it. If the enemy artillery stopped firing, soldiers would immediately think, "Oh great, something terrible is about to happen." Silence at the front didn't feel peaceful. It felt suspicious. like the world was holding its breath before something awful. Some soldiers said the quiet was worse than the explosions. At least with the noise, you knew what was happening. The silence made your imagination fill in the blanks, and trust me, a terrified imagination is both extremely creative and extremely unhelpful. Sleep during shell fire became a weird art. Some soldiers managed tiny naps between blasts. A few actually bragged about sleeping through entire barrages. "I could sleep through the world ending," one guy claimed. Another said, "If I'm tired enough, you could drop a bomb on my helmet and I'd still snore." No one was sure if they were exaggerating or just deeply broken inside. Nightmares were a whole different issue. Even when soldiers did manage to fall asleep, their dreams weren't exactly sunshine and kittens. Many dreamed of explosions. Some dreamed they were buried alive. Some dreamed they were running but couldn't move. And some woke up shouting, sweating, grabbing for rifles that weren't there. One guy wrote that he dreamed of a giant shell chasing him across a field. It rolled after him like a living thing. When he woke up, he was clutching his blanket like it owed him money. Another dreamed he was back home until the sound of real artillery blended into his dream like a storm rolling in. That's how deep the war burrowed into their minds. A lot of soldiers eventually couldn't fall asleep unless it was noisy. No joke. Their brains got so used to the constant thunder that silence felt scary. They'd say things like, "It's too quiet. I can't sleep when it's this peaceful." Imagine that, needing danger to relax. Some men said the explosions weren't the worst part. It was the waiting, the long seconds between shell whistles. The moment you heard the distant whoo, that rising sound that told you a shell was falling somewhere nearby, and you had to wait, tense, sweating, wondering if this was the one that landed in your lap. That moment froze the heart every time. And after a dozen of those moments, sleep didn't seem possible. Still, human bodies are stubborn little machines. Even in the middle of chaos, they try to rest. Soldiers would drift off for a few minutes while shells fell miles away. They'd snore softly while the sky flickered with explosions. They'd wake up disoriented, mumble something like, "I wasn't sleeping," and then immediately fall asleep again. Artillery turned nights into nightmares, awake or asleep. But somehow, through exhaustion and fear and the ridiculousness of it all, men still found ways to grab tiny pieces of sleep between the booms. Rain was another enemy of sleep, but a much sneakier one than artillery. Artillery shows up loud, angry, and dramatic. Rain just shows up and ruins your whole life slowly. It didn't just fall from the sky. It soaked everything, crawled into boots, filled trenches, turned the ground into chocolate pudding, and made every soldier feel like they were sleeping inside a damp loaf of bread. Trenches were supposed to be engineering feats, but most of them were basically long, muddy bathtubs. The water never drained fast enough. Sometimes it rose up to the soldiers' knees. Imagine trying to sleep with your boots underwater, your coat soaked, and the ground dissolving under you like a wet cookie. Some soldiers joked that if they fell asleep long enough, they might wake up as frogs. Others didn't joke. They were too busy trying to keep their feet from rotting off. Trench foot was a big problem. That's what happens when your feet stay wet for too long. They swell, crack, turn colors they should not turn, and hurt like crazy. One soldier wrote that the pain kept him awake more than the artillery did. The officers told men to take off their boots and dry their socks whenever possible, but whenever possible usually meant once every 3 days if you're lucky. When the rain got really heavy, trenches would flood overnight. Some soldiers woke up floating. One guy said he woke up face down in water and thought he had died. Another said he dreamed he was swimming, only to wake up and realize he actually was, sort of. They tried building little platforms with wooden planks, but there were never enough planks. And the rats stole them sometimes. Yes, rats stole planks. Rats were geniuses in WWI. Because the ground was constantly wet, soldiers had to get creative about staying warm. Wet clothes plus cold air equals pure misery. They wrapped themselves in blankets that smelled like wet dogs. They huddled together like penguins. They wore every piece of clothing they owned all at once. Some soldiers tried stuffing newspaper inside their coats for insulation. Others tried lining their boots with straw. None of it worked well, but when you're desperate, even failed ideas sound brilliant. The smell was unforgettable. Mud, wet wool, sweat, mold, gunpowder, and rats made a special fragrance that could probably peel paint off walls. Some soldiers said they lost the ability to smell anything pleasant ever again. Their senses just gave up. Thunderstorms were an entirely different nightmare. Lightning over the trenches looked dramatic, bright, jagged lines across the sky. But it also made everyone panic because lightning and metal rifles aren't exactly best friends. The booming thunder blended with artillery, so half the time soldiers weren't sure if nature or humans were trying to kill them. Imagine trying to sleep while playing a guessing game between normal thunder and incoming shell. Wind didn't help either. Strong winds blew water sideways into dugouts. They whipped up mud that splattered across blankets. They made tents flap loudly all night. Soldiers would bury their heads under their coats, trying to pretend nature wasn't bullying them personally. Dugouts, the little shelters carved into the trench walls, were the closest thing to a bedroom most soldiers had. Some were actually cozy by wartime standards. Wooden frames, a little straw on the floor, maybe a candle. Others were just muddy holes where water dripped from the ceiling like a leaky faucet. A few collapsed during storms, which meant sleeping inside them came with the thrilling possibility of waking up buried under dirt. Comforting, right? One soldier wrote that his dugout leaked so much he gave up trying to stay dry and just slept with a blanket over his face. Another said he squeezed into a dugout with 6 other men, all lying like sardines, and the only warm spot was the middle. But the guy in the middle kept farting, so nobody wanted it. These are the real struggles history books don't mention. But even with all the misery, the rain created weird moments of peace. Some soldiers said that after days of non-stop artillery, the sound of rain was almost soothing. A soft pattering on their helmets, a steady rhythm that made the world feel less violent. For a little while, they could close their eyes and pretend they were home on a rainy night, not sitting in a muddy trench with rats judging them. Exhaustion was so deep that sometimes, despite the cold and the wet and the thunder and everything else, soldiers truly did sleep. They'd curl into whatever shape the trench allowed, wrap their arms around themselves, and drift off. Not comfortably, not deeply, but enough to keep going another day. Cold was a whole different kind of enemy. It didn't roar like artillery or splash like rain. It just settled in, quiet and sneaky, and drained the warmth out of everyone like it was collecting it for winter storage. Winter on the Western Front hit hard, the kind of cold that bites your fingers, crawls into your bones, and makes every breath feel like inhaling tiny knives. Soldiers said it felt like the air itself hated them. Trying to sleep in that cold was nearly impossible. Blankets froze. Boots froze. Mustaches froze. One guy said he woke up and his hair was literally stuck to the inside of his helmet. Another swore that the water in his canteen froze while he was drinking it. The worst was when the mud turned into a hard, uneven surface, basically sleeping on frozen rocks. You'd lie down and immediately feel your back negotiating with your soul about quitting. Frostbite showed up like an uninvited guest. Fingers numb, toes numb, faces burning. Some men slept sitting up because if they stretched out, their feet got too cold. Others kept their boots on because taking them off meant risking they'd never get them back on again. One soldier joked that his toes were so cold he wouldn't be surprised if they snapped off like little icicles. No one laughed too much because honestly, it felt possible. To fight the cold, soldiers used whatever heat they could find. Tiny stoves, candles, little fires hidden behind mud walls. But lighting a fire in a trench was risky because smoke meant attention, and attention meant artillery. So most fires were tiny, weak things that warmed about 2 inches of air. Men would hover around them like moths, hands outstretched, arguing over whose turn it was to be close. Some soldiers slept with hot tea in their canteens, hoping it would stay warm long enough to radiate heat. Others stuffed warm stones inside their coats, but the stones cooled down so fast that it mostly just felt like hugging a cold potato. A few dugouts had actual heating pipes, but those were rare luxuries, basically the 5-star hotel version of trench life. The cold also made everything louder. Sounds travel differently in cold air. A distant gunshot cracked sharply through the night. Footsteps sounded closer than they were. Even breathing felt louder. And because soldiers slept lightly, very lightly, they woke up to every noise. A rat scurrying by, awake. A rifle shifting, awake. Someone coughing, awake, annoyed, and judging that person silently. But the cold didn't just mess with the body. It messed with the mind. Exhausted soldiers talked about dreaming of fireplaces back home. Soft beds, warm kitchens. One guy said he dreamed he was wrapped in the world's biggest blanket, only to wake up and realize he had rolled himself so tight in his real blanket that he couldn't move. He yelled for help like a trapped burrito until his friends untangled him. There were moments, though, when the cold brought a strange beauty. Frost on barbed wire glittered like silver in the moonlight. The air felt still for once, as if even war needed a break. Some soldiers said winter nights were the only times the front looked peaceful. Not quiet, never quiet, but softer somehow. You could almost pretend the world wasn't on fire. Still, nobody really slept well. Sleep came in tiny waves, short dips into unconsciousness. A few minutes here, 20 minutes there. Enough to keep a man alive, but not enough to make him feel awake. They slept curled up, tucked into coats, tucked into each other, trying to steal warmth any way they could, and yet, despite frostbite, numbness, shaking hands, and ice-cold mud, soldiers learned how to rest, maybe not comfortably, but enough to survive. The human body is weirdly good at deciding, all right, I guess this is life now, and forcing sleep anyway. Snow brought its own set of problems. But before we get to that, we've got to talk about the creepy nighttime visitors that nobody invited. Rats. Rats were everywhere. Big ones, small ones, bold ones that acted like they paid rent, and sneaky ones that sprinted across sleeping soldiers like they were running laps. Trying to sleep in a trench already felt impossible, but sleeping with rats? That was a whole new level of absolutely not. These rats weren't regular city rats. They were trench rats, evolved, beefy, confident. They ate whatever they found, food scraps, boots, candles, sometimes things way worse than that. One soldier said he saw a rat the size of a small cat dragging a piece of bread like it owned the place. Another said he woke up with 2 rats fighting on his chest like it was their personal boxing ring. Nighttime was when the rats really came alive. Soldiers lying half asleep would feel tiny feet scamper across their legs, or hear chewing sounds in the dark, or feel one sniff their ear. One poor guy woke up because a rat tried to steal his glove, while his hand was still in it. The rat tugged, he tugged back, and for 6 seconds it was basically a tug of war over a mitten. Some rats were absolute menaces. They chewed holes in bags, ripped open rations, stole bits of uniforms for nesting. One soldier joked that the rats were better supplied than the army. Another swore the rats were spying for the enemy because they always ran toward the German side after stealing something. But as awful as rats were, they were nothing compared to lice. Oh yes, lice. The tiny, disgusting creatures that turned every soldier's life into an itchy nightmare. They lived in clothes and blankets and seams of jackets. No matter how much you washed, boiled, or cursed at them, they always came back. Sleep and lice were enemies. You lie down, close your eyes, and suddenly itch, scratch, more itch, scratch again, then itch somewhere else. One soldier said sleeping with lice felt like trying to nap on top of a cactus made of angry ants. Another said he scratched so much at night that he woke up with little blood marks all over, like he'd gotten into a fight with a porcupine. The worst part was that soldiers had to share dugouts, so if one guy had lice, everyone did. Some men tried burning their uniforms over candles to kill the lice, but half the time they just burned holes into their jackets and still kept the lice. Others shaved their hair completely, but the lice just moved into their clothes like, oh cool, new apartment. Lice also caused something soldiers called trench fever, a sickness that made you feel weak, dizzy, and miserable. It didn't kill you most of the time, but it made sleeping even harder. Imagine trying to rest while shaking, sweating, and itching all at once. One soldier wrote that trench fever made him feel like his bones were vibrating. Great for a dance floor, terrible for bedtime. Then there were insects, fleas, midges, flies that showed up like they'd been personally invited. In summer months, clouds of buzzing insects hovered around men trying to nap. You know that annoying mosquito that keeps you awake at 3 a.m.? Now imagine about 50 of them, in your dugout, singing a choir of irritation directly into your ears. And let's not forget the smell. Rotting food, dead animals, unwashed bodies, sewage water, and mud all mixed together into a scent that no candle in the world could fight. It seeped into clothes, blankets, and dreams. Some soldiers wrote that the smell alone kept them awake, especially when the wind changed. One guy said it smelled like a mix between a wet dog, a garbage heap, and something you don't ever want to identify. Despite all this, soldiers tried their best to rest. They brushed off rats like annoying pets. They scratched at lice until they fell asleep from pure exhaustion. They stuffed cloth into their ears to block buzzing insects. They joked, complained, grumbled, and still managed to sleep for a few minutes at a time. Sleep became something small and precious, like a treasure you grabbed whenever you could, even if it came with rats tap dancing nearby or lice planning their next attack. Food was supposed to be comforting, right? A warm meal, a full stomach. Those things usually help people fall asleep. Not in World War I. Food in the trenches wasn't comfort. It was a challenge, a punishment, a mysterious experience that made soldiers question their life choices. Let's start with the famous trench delicacy, hardtack. Hardtack was basically a biscuit, if a biscuit were made by someone who hated joy. It was so hard soldiers joked you could use it as armor. Some said you needed a hammer just to crack it. Others dipped it in tea for half an hour and it still stayed crunchy. One soldier wrote that he tried to bite it and felt like he was trying to eat a brick. Eating it before bed was a gamble. You'd lie down with tiny rock-like crumbs scraping inside your mouth. Some guys woke up in the night coughing because the crumbs had sharp corners. Yes, sharp corners. War is wild. Then there was bully beef, canned meat. Greasy, salty, dense, weird-smelling, and always suspicious. Soldiers ate it because they had to, not because they wanted to. One guy said eating bully beef gave him nightmares about cows chasing him with spoons. Another swore that one of his cans had been older than he was. Sleeping after eating this stuff? Not easy. The grease sat in your stomach like a stone. Some men slept sitting up just so it wouldn't come back up. Others burped their way through the night like broken accordions, and the smell of bully beef didn't help. Once a can was opened, the scent stayed in the dugout for hours, lingering like a ghost made of beef. Tea was the lifeline, even bad tea, even weak tea. Soldiers drank it all day, sometimes all night. It warmed them, comforted them, and kept them awake when they didn't want to be awake. But sometimes tea made sleep harder. Too much caffeine, too much warmth, too many thoughts at 2 a.m. One soldier wrote that he couldn't sleep because his mind kept replaying every mistake he'd ever made, powered by 14 cups of military-grade tea. Food shortages made things worse. Some nights soldiers went to sleep hungry, which meant they didn't really sleep at all. Their stomachs growled like angry animals. One guy said the hunger pangs were so loud his friend told him to keep it down before the rats get ideas. Then there was the smell of cooking. Sometimes, if the front was quiet, cooks prepared something warm, soup, stew, whatever they could manage. But the smell drifting down the trench didn't always help tired men sleep. It reminded them of home. It made them miss family dinners, warm kitchens, peaceful nights. Some soldiers cried quietly into their blankets, not from fear or pain, but because the stew reminded them too much of their mother's cooking. Other times, the food was so bad that the smell kept everyone awake. Burned stew, sour bread, mystery meat that nobody wanted to identify. One soldier wrote that he smelled something cooking one night, got excited, went to check, and discovered it was a pot of something that should not have been resurrected. And let's not forget the stomach problems. Bad food equals bad sleep. Soldiers complained constantly of cramps, bloating, gas, which their friends absolutely did not appreciate in shared dugouts, and sudden midnight sprints to the latrines, if there even were latrines. Some nights, the whole trench echoed with groans, not from artillery, but from 200 men having the same digestive regret at the same time. Food shaped sleep in the trenches more than people think. A warm meal helped on the rare days it tasted good. A bad one ruined the whole night. Hunger haunted dreams. Comfort food made hearts ache. Bad beef made stomachs revolt. But no matter what they ate, hardtack rocks, beef mush, watery soup, or stale bread, soldiers still laid down, closed their eyes, and tried to drift off, even if their stomachs argued about it the entire time. Letters were another strange bedtime companion. You'd think writing or reading a letter would be comforting, maybe even relaxing. But in the trenches, letters were like tiny emotional landmines. They could make you laugh, make you cry, or remind you how far away home really was, all in the span of a single paragraph. Soldiers spent hours at night writing letters by candlelight. Some scribbled quick notes about the day, jokes for their mothers, or reassurances to sweethearts. Others poured out their deepest thoughts, the fear, the boredom, the mud, the rats, the cold, the nightmares. One man wrote, "If I don't make it, tell them I fought bravely, and I really hated hardtack." His friend laughed while reading it. but it was the kind of laugh that stuck in your throat. Letters weren't just about writing. Reading them could also be dangerous for sleep. A sweet note from a loved one might bring warmth, but it could also open a floodgate of homesickness. Soldiers described clutching letters under their blankets, reading the same sentence over and over until the candle burned low, tears mixing with mud on their faces. It was a strange kind of therapy, somehow comforting and tormenting at the same time. Sometimes letters became a secret ritual. Soldiers would pass them quietly in dugouts, reading others' notes when the writer wasn't looking. Some swapped jokes. Others shared small drawings, little sketches of home, funny faces, or animals. In the darkness, these scraps of humanity kept them connected to the world beyond the trenches, even if it was just for a few minutes. But letters could also wake a man up in the middle of the night. A letter arriving at a dugout might contain news of a death, a promotion, or some change he couldn't control. Men read in silence, sometimes whispering a single word, other times folding the paper and staring into space, too exhausted to react further. Even the act of hiding letters became part of nightly life. Soldiers stuffed them into coat pockets, boots, or secret compartments in their helmets. They wanted them close, but safe, like treasures that might save their sanity. And yet, despite the risk, letters were small islands of peace. In a world that never stopped moving, never stopped screaming, never stopped being wet, cold, and loud, letters offered a moment to pause, a moment to remember warmth, love, family, and home. Some soldiers fell asleep with letters clutched in their hands, imagining that the paper's words would guard them from nightmares. Others read until exhaustion forced their eyes shut. Even if sleep didn't come immediately, letters gave them something softer to think about than mud, rats, or artillery. It was strange. War had taken almost everything: comfort, safety, quiet, control. But letters, those fragile sheets of paper, remained a bridge to humanity. A reminder that even when sleep was impossible, connection was still possible. Doctors tried to step in, but even they were fighting an uphill battle. Nighttime exhaustion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Soldiers weren't just tired, they were reaching the limits of what a human body could handle. Some men went days without proper sleep, and the results were obvious: shaking hands, muddled thoughts, paranoia, and hallucinations. Medical officers documented everything they could. They called it war strain, shell shock, or combat fatigue, though the terms weren't always precise. Soldiers shaking uncontrollably after nights without sleep were common. Some stared blankly at walls, muttering nonsense, convinced the trenches were alive. Others developed night terrors, screaming and thrashing in their few moments of unconsciousness. Doctors tried a few strategies. Warm drinks helped a little: tea, cocoa, or even a small bit of alcohol when available. Sometimes soldiers were given early sedatives, although dosing was tricky and not exactly safe by modern standards. Officers attempted sleep rotations, letting men rest in shifts so someone was always awake while others slept. In theory, it was a good plan. In practice, enemy raids, artillery, and flooding rarely allowed it to work properly. Sleep deprivation affected more than just the mind. It weakened the body, lowered immunity, and made injuries worse. Men who might survive a minor wound could succumb to infection or frostbite simply because their bodies didn't have the energy to fight back. Doctors saw this constantly and tried to intervene wherever they could. Sometimes that meant moving soldiers to rest camps behind the lines. Other times it meant simple advice: wrap up, stay dry, eat what you can, and close your eyes for even 10 minutes if possible. Soldiers learned to improvise too. Some would lie down anywhere, on boards, sandbags, or even leaning against walls, just to get a few seconds of rest. Others found rhythmic breathing or humming to help calm their minds, a personal trick to cheat exhaustion. The human body is remarkably stubborn. Even in impossible conditions, it seeks sleep, even if only in tiny fragments. Some of the most striking observations were psychological. Doctors noted that soldiers who slept poorly became irritable, paranoid, or overly jumpy. They might lash out at comrades for minor annoyances or misjudge situations entirely. Sleep wasn't just comfort, it was a battlefield tool. The lack of it could be as deadly as a sniper's bullet. Still, despite exhaustion, frostbite, rats, lice, artillery, hunger, and nightmares, men adapted. Tiny moments of rest, even in the worst conditions, allowed them to survive another day. Doctors observed it, soldiers experienced it, and history recorded it. Sleep in World War I wasn't optional, it was an ongoing fight. No matter which side of the trenches you were on, night had a way of leveling everyone. German, British, French, Ottoman, names, uniforms, and flags didn't matter once darkness fell. Soldiers on all fronts faced the same problems: fear, mud, rats, cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Diaries from different armies reveal striking similarities. One German soldier wrote about crawling into a narrow dugout, hugging his rifle, listening to artillery and rats, thinking about home. A British soldier did the exact same thing miles away. An Ottoman soldier described freezing nights on the desert front, wrapped in blankets, hearing the wind howl through the tents while dreaming of his family. Every man shared the same basic struggle: surviving the night. Nightmares weren't limited by nationality. Soldiers on all sides dreamt of explosions, being buried alive, or running endlessly through mud and darkness. Some woke up screaming, shaking, or clinging to whatever human or inanimate object was nearby. The universality of these experiences created a quiet, unspoken bond, even between enemies. There were moments, too, when soldiers on opposing sides recognized this shared humanity. Letters from soldiers mentioned noticing footprints in the mud from the other side, wondering about the people who left them. During rare lulls in fighting, soldiers sometimes glimpsed each other across no man's land at night, both too tired and too wary to do more than silently nod or shrug. These fleeting recognitions didn't stop the war, but they were reminders that fear, exhaustion, and the need for sleep were universal. Even rituals were similar. Men huddled in small groups, shared blankets, whispered jokes, or sang quietly. Music, folk songs, religious hymns, and sometimes just humming, helped the mind survive. Soldiers tucked letters under pillows, kept small tokens from home nearby, and used every tiny comfort to fight the relentless night. The trenches were different in appearance and climate, but the experience of night was eerily similar everywhere. Silence was deceptive, darkness was oppressive, and exhaustion was absolute. Each man fought sleep and fear, and each found fleeting victories whenever his eyes finally shut for a few minutes. This shared struggle made sleep, when it happened, precious. Even if it was short or troubled, it became a small act of resistance, a moment to reclaim humanity in a world bent on stripping it away. As the war dragged on, soldiers developed routines, fragile lifelines against the chaos of night. They called them sleeping shifts, though calling them shifts might be too generous. The idea was simple: someone stayed alert while others rested. In theory, this minimized danger while maximizing the chance for a few minutes of shut-eye. In practice, it was chaotic, inconsistent, and often futile. Some men were assigned watch duty, which meant standing, leaning or crouching in the trench, eyes straining through darkness, ears listening for the faintest sound. Footsteps, wire snapping, distant artillery, enemy whispers, every little noise was a test. You couldn't sleep while on watch, but knowing your comrades rested gave some comfort. It was a balancing act of trust and exhaustion. Rotating into rest was another story. Soldiers collapsed into whatever spot they could find, sometimes sharing blankets with friends, sometimes lying on wet planks, sometimes bracing themselves against mud walls. These moments were short, punctuated by interruptions from artillery, rats, water, or the ever-present fear of a raid. Yet even 30 seconds of sleep was better than none. Improvisation became key. Men learned to sleep sitting up to stay alert. Others used packs as makeshift pillows, helmets as headrests, or even mud to create small indentations for lying down. Some soldiers invented their own rituals, humming quietly, counting breaths, imagining home, or reciting prayers to coax their minds into rest. The human body adapted in strange ways. Some men reported being able to sleep anywhere, under any condition, as long as their minds could convince themselves it was safe for a few moments. Others developed acute awareness, waking at the tiniest change in sound or smell. Sleep became a skill, a negotiation with your own body and the battlefield around you. Even with routines, nights remained unpredictable. Shelling could start suddenly, rain could flood a dugout, mud could collapse beneath you, or rats could stage a midnight invasion. Soldiers learned to treat every moment of sleep as temporary, precious, and fragile. You never fully let your guard down. Through all of this, soldiers shared a quiet camaraderie. They traded tips for staying warm, jokes for keeping spirits up, and small gestures, like sharing a blanket or offering a sip of tea, to help each other survive. Sleep wasn't just a physical need. It was a shared struggle, a nightly battle in a war already consuming every part of life. Sleep in the trenches was never easy, never guaranteed. But it was vital. Every fleeting nap, every brief moment of unconsciousness was a small rebellion against exhaustion, fear, and the relentless demands of war. Soldiers learned that even in the darkest, muddiest, coldest nights, a few minutes of rest could keep them human. Silence in the trenches was rare, but when it came, it was almost unbearable. Soldiers called it the false quiet, because it never lasted long and usually meant something was about to happen. The quiet of a trench at night was deceptive. You couldn't tell whether it was safe to drift off or whether danger was simply biding its time. Some nights, the only sounds were rats scuttling across mud, water dripping from the walls, and the occasional groan of a soldier shifting in his damp blanket. But the mind, exhausted and alert at the same time, filled the gaps. Imagined footsteps, whispers, and distant shouts became as vivid as reality. Soldiers described hearing the enemy sneaking up on them, only to wake and find it was a shadow, a puddle, or just their imagination running wild. Paranoia became almost a survival skill. You learned to differentiate between real and imagined threats, but not perfectly. A snapped twig could mean a night raid or a rat. A distant whisper could be the enemy or a soldier talking in his sleep. Every noise made your heart jump, your hands tighten on your rifle, and your mind race. Sleep, when it came, was light, jittery, and broken. Even small comforts became lifesavers. A friend humming softly, a shared blanket, a letter tucked into a pocket, or a warm sip of tea could quiet the mind just enough to allow a few moments of rest. Soldiers became masters of micro-sleep, nodding off for a few minutes, waking with a start, and then trying again. Some soldiers developed habits to trick themselves into sleep. Counting breaths, repeating prayers, imagining home, or inventing mental games all became tools to survive the night. Others relied on routines, lying in the same position, holding their rifle in a particular way, or leaning against a familiar part of the trench. Anything to create a small sense of control. Sleep in the trenches was also deeply social. Soldiers watched over one another, nudged friends awake when danger seemed real, and shared small jokes to lighten the oppressive darkness. That camaraderie became as important as any blanket or warm coat. Being together, even half asleep, reminded them they weren't entirely alone in the mud, the cold, or the fear. And yet, no matter what strategies they developed, sleep was always fragile. Artillery could start, rain could flood a dugout, or enemy patrols could appear. Every nap was a compromise between rest and readiness. Soldiers never fully relaxed, but even the tiniest rest counted. The trenches taught that sleep was not a luxury. It was a survival tool. In the middle of mud, cold, rats, lice, hunger, fear, and constant threat, human beings found a way to steal a few minutes of rest. Those minutes, brief and precious, were enough to carry them into another day. By the time the war dragged on into its later years, soldiers had developed strange rhythms to cope with nights that seemed endless. They became experts at resting in impossible positions, dozing in shifts, and making sleep happen in tiny fragments. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't restorative, but it kept them alive. Men learned to recognize the subtle cues of danger and adjust their rest accordingly. The first distant rumble of artillery meant bracing oneself. A shadow moving across the trench called for alertness. Even a lull in the wind or the sudden absence of rats could make a soldier tense. Sleep became a negotiation between body, mind, and environment. You never gave yourself fully to it. Humor and imagination played a role too. Soldiers told each other ridiculous stories to distract themselves from fear. One guy described sleeping under a blanket that he swore was plotting against him. Another claimed his boots tried to escape in the middle of the night. Laughter, even brief and quiet, was a lifeline. It made the darkness tolerable, if only for a few seconds at a time. The shared experience of sleepless nights bonded soldiers. They learned the exact ways to keep each other alert yet comfortable. Sharing blankets, holding a post together, or exchanging letters and small jokes became part of the nightly routine. Even when the trenches were wet, cold, and crawling with rats and lice, these little acts of camaraderie reminded them that they weren't alone. Some soldiers reached remarkable adaptations. They could nap anywhere, standing, leaning, or lying on mud-soaked planks. They mastered micro-sleeps, closing their eyes for seconds at a time without fully drifting off. Others could sleep through the constant background of artillery or the scuttling of rats, though the first alarm or warning whistle would wake them instantly. Sleep was never deep, and nightmares were constant companions. Soldiers dreamed of artillery, mud, being trapped, or lost loved ones. Some woke screaming. Some simply woke and stared into darkness, hearts racing. Yet every tiny nap, every moment of rest counted. It was fuel for another day, another patrol, another round in the mud and cold. By now, the soldiers understood that sleep was no longer about comfort or peace. It was about survival, endurance, and holding on to a fragment of humanity in a world designed to strip it away. They learned to cherish minutes of unconsciousness, to protect those moments fiercely, and to find humor, warmth, or camaraderie wherever they could. The trenches didn't allow for restful sleep, but they taught resilience. Every night survived was a victory, every few minutes of rest a hard-won triumph. In the end, soldiers didn't just fight the enemy, they fought exhaustion, fear, mud, cold, rats, lice, hunger, and the ceaseless nights. And somehow, through it all, they slept. The story of how soldiers slept or didn't in World War I is one of struggle, adaptation, and human persistence. Sleep became a battlefield itself, and every soldier who managed to close his eyes even for a moment had achieved something remarkable. And so, as the war finally edged toward its close, the nights in the trenches remained just as harsh, but the soldiers had learned to live within them. They had mastered micro-naps, developed routines, shared small comforts, and relied on camaraderie to survive the endless cycles of mud, cold, rats, lice, hunger, and artillery. Every short sleep, every stolen moment of rest, became a symbol of endurance, a tiny victory in a world determined to keep them awake. By the final months of the war, men understood something fundamental. Sleep was not just rest. It was survival, sanity, and a quiet rebellion against the chaos surrounding them. Whether it was dozing through the distant rumble of artillery, huddling with comrades for warmth, or clutching a letter from home to ward off nightmares, each night became a battle fought not only against the enemy, but against exhaustion itself. When soldiers finally left the trenches, many found sleep both familiar and strange. Their bodies craved it, their minds demanded it, and yet it came with lingering memories of rats, mud, cold, and fear. Sleep in the trenches had been brutal, fragmented, and fleeting, but it had also been a testament to human resilience. Men had survived unimaginable conditions, adapting to nights that were designed to rob them of rest. And in doing so, they had demonstrated the stubborn, remarkable ability of the human spirit to endure, and so, the story of how soldiers slept, or struggled to sleep, during World War I reminds us that even in the darkest, most uncomfortable, most relentless circumstances, people find ways to survive, to rest, and to hold on to their humanity. Night after night, amidst mud, cold, rats, artillery, and fear, soldiers fought not only for life, but for the small, precious moments of sleep that allowed them to face another day.